what I wanted to do here is give you a introduction to economic principles applied to the agriculture topic. What I've done so far was a sort of a general introduction to the political economy of agriculture and public policy. But here, we're going to start with just basic economics. Economics starts with the idea of scarcity. We don't have enough of everything for everyone, and so people have to make choices to deal with scarcity. So our survival turns on the scarcity of food, clothing, shelter. And producing each of these requires labor and know-how or knowledge. So when economists talk about the economy, they often talk about the production of goods and services, labor producing those services, companies, and entrepreneurs finding new ways to make goods and services at better quality or lower price. In agriculture, we have centuries of entrepreneurship in discovering better crops, better agricultural techniques. We've gone from to low-till and no-till operations so we don't lose as much topsoil. Fertilizers and pesticides tend to get better. Farmers learn ways to use less. Corn productivity per acre has gone up dramatically each decade over a century. So we now, what used to be in Europe and around the world and much of the world still today, the ability to grow enough food was a real challenge, and you'd have famines through history, stunning famines even through the 18th century in Europe and France. But that's sort of behind us. In the Western world and modern economies, food production has so dramatically increased that we don't worry about shortages of food anymore. But providing food, clothing, shelter is sort of the core requirements of a society. How do you do that? Well, tribal societies produce the basics. They have traditions that inform the leaders of the tribe. The work, the knowledge, the exchange, that's divided among a few dozen or a few hundred people in a tribal society. Native Americans in the U.S., tribes in Africa or Western Europe in ancient times. But in modern societies, that division of knowledge, the division of labor is spread much more broadly. So on the one hand, a small group of people used to have all the knowledge they needed to survive. What foods to grow, where to hunt, how to make canoes, how to make clothing. We no longer have individually that knowledge, or in families that knowledge. Most of us would have a hard time growing food to survive or making the clothes we need. But that division of labor also allows a dramatic increase in productivity. Adam Smith talked about the pin factory. If you were trying to make pins yourself, you'd spend all day just making a couple. But if you could divide that labor among 50 or 100 people who specialize in different aspects of the production of a pin, you can dramatically increase the total number of pins or the number of pins per person. Similarly in farming, as we specialize, farmers that focus on growing corn or growing wheat or growing cotton, they're able to dramatically increase their productivity using machinery and combines and all sorts of modern technology. So that productivity in agriculture, the division of labor, is key there. Similarly in making automobiles, tools, other goods and services. So this division of labor across millions expands the scope of trade. We import spices from India rather than trying to figure out how to grow them here. And there's gains from the trade across long distances. A big part of the U.S. economy is the exports of manufactured goods and agricultural products to other countries. Similarly, we import goods and services from around the world. But how does all this work? Again, you could have a traditional thing where everyone did what their parents did. That's not going to work in a modern society. You could have a command economy where the leaders are trying to tell everyone what to do, hiring economists to do it. This was the story in Eastern European economies under communism, in the Soviet Union and China under communism. These were command economies. What we have instead in the US and most of the world now are mixed economies. They're part market economies for some sector, and they're part government-directed economies. So in the US, for homeschools, for example, you're in a market economy or a family economy for education. Each family is managing its education, and you're networking with clubs and groups to get an education. But for most Americans, the government is running the education system. The city, the county, the state are running schools. The federal government is funding and making rules and directions. There's markets involved, companies that make textbooks and so forth. There are for-profit companies. But if you look throughout the economy, in healthcare, in retirement security, you have in education, you've got a big chunk of government making rules and deciding who does what. But in other aspects, in the computer industry, in the automobile industry, you have a major role for the private sector. Agriculture is tricky because part of agriculture is private, market-based. Again, fruits and vegetables I mentioned earlier, and a whole range of crops don't involve government at all. But there are major crops where government plays a dominant role. Private companies grow cotton, grow wheat, grow corn, but the government sort of sets the rules, sets a parity pricing, or subsidizes insurance, and that has a huge effect on the way that industry runs. Debaters could call for moving more to the market, getting rid of restrictions and subsidies for peanuts and sugar and a dozen other crops. This would reduce prices to consumers, reduce burdens to taxpayers, but would have a significant effect on the farmers in those industries who've adjusted their business to the current subsidies and federal programs. Generally, though, economics, you have to sort of say, do you trust the private sector and markets and companies to run the industry, or do you think government should step in and regulate, subsidize, and control? And people are different in their beliefs on this. Understanding economics will give you insight in how markets can work, even though as individuals we don't really understand, how to farm wheat, how to farm corn, what it would take to raise peanuts. Markets coordinate the production and exchange of a vast number of goods and services across millions of producers and consumers. And so we're sort of in a strange position of even debating this topic. Why should the government be involved in agriculture? Why should there be agricultural policies? Do we have computer policies or laptop policies or smartphone policies, or why do we have the government only in some sectors and not in others? Well, there's a history to that in agriculture. If you look back through American history, back to the 1850s, we had 23 million people in the country, far fewer than the 320 million we have now. The farm population was smaller, 11 million farmers, but about half. So 64% of the labor force in 1850 were farmers. So most Americans were in farming. 1870, it drops. 1900, it drops. So the population quadrupled in the country to 75 million in 1900. The farm population increased too, to about 30 million, but it's now only 38% of the labor force instead of 64% 50 years earlier. And just running down those numbers, you can do this. So you jump ahead to 1960. Now we've got 180 million people in the country. The farm population is down to 15 million. Farmers are just 8.3% of the labor force. 3 million farms. A lot of those, of course, are very small farms. So we've had this shift over a century from 1850 to 1960 that's dramatically lowered the number of Americans that are involved in farming. That's because the productivity's increased dramatically, the size of farms and the mechanization of farms has increased dramatically. Then you move ahead to 1990, that's still 25 years ago. Population's up another 80 million to 260 million. Farm population dropped dramatically, 1960 to 1990. So from 15 million, 15.6 million, it dropped to barely 3 million. So just 2.6% of the labor force, and it's even smaller today. So I present this to give a sense of a lot of our agricultural policies come from the 1920s and 30s, when the farm population was 30% of the labor force. Now it's 1/10 of that, and yet we still have policies based on reality decades and decades ago. So we want to I encourage you to look at the agricultural subsidy programs just to get a sense of what those programs are. We have a long history of falling prices for U.S. crops as productivity went up. Prices surged dramatically in wartime, during World War I, for example. But after World War I, when the Europeans could again start to grow their own food, prices collapsed. And that's when U.S. government jumped into agriculture in a big way, trying to create a parity, trying to put price supports in. But the price supports were set for World War I prices that were high, mainly because Europe wasn't able to produce food during the war. So we have a long history of legislative efforts to raise food prices. Well, actually raise prices of crops, because the farmers tend to have concentrated interests in this legislation. Everyday people tend not to be involved in something as food as consumers. So the New Deal, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, is the big intervention in 1933. The Supreme Court struck that down as unconstitutional. After the new Supreme Court was put in place with new justices appointed by Franklin Roosevelt, the new Agricultural Adjustment Act was passed, and a lot of the agricultural policies that allowed the federal government to be involved were deemed constitutional. So again, it gets complicated. They try to keep the price up, people expand. The government, the economists felt the problem was overproduction, so they had to find ways to restrict how much land farmers planted, which we have today, which leads to overuse of fertilizers and pesticides in accordance to government policies that limit the land. So a big mess, huge waste. Bert Folsom has a great essay on blue potatoes in the New Deal and a number of dramatic destructive programs, and we still have bits and pieces of that today and billions of dollars of spending.